Without further ado, I will just start with Max's presentation. Max, please, after you introduce yourself, go ahead into your session, into your presentation. Sorry.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, George. I'm Max Ward. I'm actually just going to share my slides with you. That also has my introductory kind of information on it. I'm Max Ward, Associate Professor of Japanese History at Middlebury College in Vermont, the United States. And I will be talking about kind of an idea of how we can think of a conceptual history of Tenkō. First, let me thank the EAJS for allowing us to share our research with you. George and Irena for inviting me to join this panel. Thank you very much. And of course, all of you attending today, as well as all the tech support and everybody who's kind of working behind the scenes to make this happen. It's very appreciated. So, as scholars of modern Japan, we are all aware of the ubiquity of the term Tenkō in modern Japanese political and intellectual history, as well as the various theoretical investments that Tenkō has accrued over the decades. This complex history of Tenkō begins with the different reasons incarcerated communists gave for defecting from the Japanese Communist Party in the mid-1930s, how proletarian writers reflected on their defections in semi-autobiographical writings, to the expansion and systemization of defection into a state policy for administering political crime cases in the Japanese Empire in 1936, something that I deal with more extensively in my first book. To then in the post-war, Japanese scholars pursued a variety of larger questions through the interwar Tenkō phenomenon, and that includes, of course, the Shuteisei Ronso, the debates over modern subjectivity, the paradigmatic shifts in Japanese intellectual history, the political responsibility of literature, the role of the intellectual in modern society, or revealing the constitutive contradictions of Japanese modernity or modernity in general. As this cursory and admittedly incomplete summary makes clear, Tenkō's meaning has expanded well beyond either its basic definition as a change in direction or its more historically specific definition of ideological conversion. So when Irena, George, and Mark Williams kindly invited me to write something for the volume Tenkō Cultures of Political Conversion in Transwar Japan, I wanted to use the opportunity to consider how we might begin to develop a conceptual history of Tenkō that can account for all the diverse practices, political positions, and theoretical investments that the term has accrued over the transwar period and beyond. So today I will draw upon portions of my chapter in which I question some of the underlying assumptions that inform our received understanding of Tenkō, both as a historical phenomenon, as well as a theory of political or modern subjectivity, and what these might overlook or exclude from consideration. And although time does not permit for me to elaborate the framework for a new conceptual history of Tenkō that I propose in my chapter, I hope that by questioning some of the conventional explanations of Tenkō that I can alert us to both the enduring challenges as well as continuing possibilities for studying this, both conceptually as well as a historical phenomenon. So, as most of you are probably well aware, the term Tenkō came to be understood as signifying an act of political defection or ideological conversion in the summer of 1933, when it was reported that two incarcerated JCP leaders, Sano Manabu and Namiyama Sadachika, had renounced the policies of the Communist International as ill-suited to the realities of Japan and condemned their own JCP's slavish adherence to Moscow's directives. Excuse me. In a co-authored letter titled "A Letter to Our Fellow Defendants," Sano and Nabiyama announced a significant change, Juyo na Henko, in their political position and urged their comrades to break with the Comintern, recognize the nationalist sentiments of the Japanese working class, and to reconsider socialism along nationalist lines. The authorities released the letter to the press on June 10th, as we see here, and distributed the letter to 600 other incarcerated communist members throughout the country on June 13th. In the weeks following the Sano-Nabiyama announcement, Justice Ministry procurators met in Tokyo to take stock of these renunciations and to consider methods for inspiring other communists to defect. Their efforts paid off, and by the end of the summer of 1933, hundreds of incarcerated JCP members renounced the party and the Comintern, and in this way, the infamous mass Tenkō of 1933-1934 was engineered. Now, it is true that Sano Nabiyama's defection marks the beginning of what would become the mass Tenkō, but we must consider what this means in regards to the semantic or historical origins of this term. For example, the authoritative Kodansha Encyclopedia of Japan tells us that, quote, the term was coined in 1933 by Sano Manabu and Nabiyama Sadachika, unquote, when they, quote, announced from prison that they had made a political change of direction, or Tenkō, and were breaking their ties with the Communist Party, unquote. However, importantly, Sano Nabiyama did not use the term Tenkō in their declaration. I think that's just a very interesting starting point. In other words, in the text that is conventionally understood as initiating the very phenomenon, the term is curiously absent. In a longer unpublicized report drafted for prison officials, so this is unpublished, Sano and Nabiyama did use the term Tenkō in passing, but in a negative sense, in order to distinguish their reconsideration of political praxis. And this is what they write. Quote, we recognize our responsibility for the party and believe it is absolutely necessary at this time to turn to the working class and reveal the correct path forward. It would be dishonorable and shameful to secretly turn inwards and individually convert. Now, we must take the initiative and have the responsibility to publicly recognize the errors we have made to our comrades and based on our new consciousness to reveal to the public a new course of action, unquote. As we can see here, Sano Nabiyama refer to Tenkō in largely negative sense. In other words, as signifying an individual process of introspection and conversion, not a public declaration of error and reorientation of political strategy. Rather, it was the authorities that used the term Tenkō when they informed the press of Sano Nabiyama's defection on June 10th, thereby introducing the term into public discourse. In fact, justice officials had already started using the term Tenkō by the spring of 1933 to signify something to the effect of some kind of repentance or defection or something. For example, in 1932, district court procurators passed a directive that mandated assessing, quote, whether or not a political suspect can effect a thought conversion and maintain a conventional life, unquote, before advancing a case to trial. Now, this was, in fact, the first time that the term Tenkō had been used in regards to a political defection. So this is 1932. Then in May 1933, 1 month before Sano Nabiyama's letter was released, Tokyo District Court procurators outlined new procedures to assess and guide, quote, thought criminals who ideologically convert, unquote. Now, I do not believe that the essential meaning of the term is to be found in this origin. But I do think we need to consider what it means that state officials were already engaged in debating the meaning and practice of Tenkō before Sano Nabiyama ostensibly performed it. Furthermore, state officials, rather than providing a stable and continuous definition of Tenkō, continually debated and redefined it in response to the changing situation of political crime through the 1930s and 1940s, producing volumes of writings on the term. As I show in my chapter in the volume, the official definition of Tenkō applied in political crime cases shifts from a negative meaning in 1930, where it's about breaking from the party, renouncing, etc., to an increasingly positive generative meaning by 1936, in which a detainee was expected to manifest positive identifications with national and imperial identity that turned Tenkō into a continuing process with gradation. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. In other words, in contrast to the conventional portrayal of the state as merely an external force that coerced leftist intellectuals to ostensibly change their thought, perhaps we should see state officials as themselves implicated in the theorization of Tenkō and thus to the intellectual or conceptual history of the term. Furthermore, it was from their engagement with detained rank and file communists that officials refined their definition of Tenkō, which is to say that while conventional studies of Tenkō focus almost entirely on the experiences of intellectuals, JCP leadership, or proletarian writers, another element missing from the narrative is that hundreds of rank and file activists declared Tenkō, and although not intellectuals per se, they wrote volumes on their experiences and helped to define how Tenkō was codified by the state in the mid-1930s. For example, only 6 months after the Sano Nabiyama defection, a collection entitled Tenkō Memoirs was published in November 1933. This volume collected essays by recent converts, many of whom had received guidance from a Tokyo-based criminal reform group called the Imperial Renovation Society. As I explore more fully in my first book, the Imperial Renovation Society started to take on political criminals as early as 1931, and following the Sano Nabiyama defection in 1933 led the way in defining the procedures and practices of what was by then being referred to as an act of Tenkō. Heading up the society's ideological rehabilitation efforts was an ex-communist convert named Kobayashi Morito, who, after defecting from the JCP in 1931, started working at the society in 1932. In that first year, Kobayashi penned a semi-autobiographical book on his defection up until leaving the Communist Party under the pen name Ono Yoichi. Note that this was before the term Tenkō encapsulated the various motivations or forms for defecting from the JCP. Rather, Kobayashi narrated his transformation in jail and his decision to defect as a religious transformation, using terms such as revived, reborn, total salvation, and an awakening to the self. Ultimately, Kobayashi narrates his decision to defect as a departure from the Marxian, quote, world of struggle to the world of religion, of true Pure Land Buddhism. Kobayashi's semi-autobiographical book was distributed to other incarcerated communists and within a few years would serve as a model for what would soon be categorized as a religious conversion. We might consider Kobayashi as constituting an important chapter in the conceptual prehistory of Tenkō. However, once the term Tenkō came to signify political defection in spring 1933, Kobayashi's early semi-biographical book provided a model for hundreds of other rank and file communists to follow, as we find in the essays in Tenkō Memoirs. The contributors to Tenkō Memoirs were not leaders or theoreticians in the JCP, and thus we can read the book as addressing rank and file communists. The different social backgrounds and statuses of the contributors encompass all sectors of Japanese society, ranging from farmer and rural organizers, a college student, a female activist, industrial laborer, among other variants. The cumulative effect was that whether laborer, student, or rural tenant, these converted rank and file communists shared a similar conversion experience informed by Buddhism that returned them to their respective stations in society. And as Adam Lyons and Shigeta Shinji have recently analyzed, Buddhist chaplains played an important role in the conversion process, and particularly this chaplain in Tokyo by the name of Fuji Esho. However, if the 1933 collection depicted Tenkō generally in negative terms, similar to the state's 1933 definition, i.e. as a break or a renunciation, effectively making Tenkō a single decision, and Tenkō ends when that decision is made and one is released out into society. Around the time that Tenkō became codified in the system of what was called Thought Criminal Protection and Supervision Centers established in 1937, converts emphasized the need to continually confirm their loyalty to the Japanese Kokutai and emperor as they were paroled back into society and struggled to integrate. In other words, the narrative Tenkō in such volumes as we see here of the thoughts and lives of Tenkō or converts depict Tenkō as a continual process with different degrees of manifestation and varying success. So before transitioning to the post-war period, I would like to conclude this section by asking, what happens if we included not only intellectuals and party theoreticians in our conceptual history of Tenkō, but also state officials as well as rank and file communists, if not also prison chaplains? How might their incorporation, as well as their transforming definition and practice of Tenkō, alter our understanding of it as a practice and experience that up until now has been portrayed as limited only to intellectuals and their changing ideas? So this then serves as a segue into discussing post-war theories of Tenkō, for it really is in the post-war that Tenkō is refigured as a problem primarily of Japanese intellectual history, in which the two elements that I discussed earlier, state officials and rank and file activists, are largely excluded from consideration. Sometimes they're discussed, but not as the central focus. As is well known, in the 1950s, Tenkō became a lens through which many intellectuals, writers, and activists theorized and debated over ethics, subjectivity, and political praxis in the new post-war situation. The exemplary work in this regard was, of course, Tsurumi Shinsuke and the Shiso no Kagaku Kenkyukai, or the Science of Thought, a 3-volume study of Tenkō that was starting to be published in 1959, which consists of roughly 36 individual biographies of intellectuals, writers, or political activists who supposedly committed Tenkō in the interwar period. Now, in his introduction, Tsurumi proposed a general definition of Tenkō that he believed would both account for the variety of motivations, experiences, and degrees of ideological conversion, as well as remain objective so as not to pass judgment on those who had converted. Towards this end, Tsurumi defined Tenkō as, quote, a change of thought under the coercion of state power, unquote. He elaborated that Tenkō had 2 essential components, quote, the compulsion exercised by the state and the response chosen by the individual or group. The use of force and the existence of spontaneity are the 2 essential elements, unquote. Now, Tsurumi's dualistic definition of Tenkō as a phenomenon produced between coercion and spontaneity, between external state power and the internal thoughts or motivations of an individual, was hugely influential and continues to inform many studies today. Now, there have been critiques of Tsurumi's definition, but tellingly, these criticisms have emphasized either state coercion or individual spontaneity, consequently reinforcing the duality. What I believe is missing in the theorizations of ideological conversion, starting with Tsurumi's influential definition, is paradoxically a theory of ideology. For instance, many studies recognize the role of state coercion, but it is unclear if the coercion that the state exerted was itself of an ideological nature, or, as Tsurumi's definition implies, was merely an external force that acted upon the ideological disposition of an individual. From the other direction, it is also unclear whether the new dispositions or activities of a convert were more than expressing a new set of ideas themselves ideological. Where do we place ideology? Is the belief in communism ideological, or is the turn to nationalism and imperial identity ideological, right? In many studies of Tenkō, ideology refers merely to the ideas that exist in the mind of an individual before and after their supposed conversion, in which Tenkō is a unilinear shift from one set of ideas, i.e. Marxism, to another set of ideas, often nationalism. Now, ultimately, more than just a theory of ideology, what I believe is lacking in the conventional explanations of Tenkō is attention to ideological mediation in the process of so-called conversion. In other words, a theory of Tenkō needs to account for how it first signified simply renouncing the JCP and Marxism in 1933, but through experimentation in penal policy and the continuing reflection of rank and file JCP converts, Tenkō dialectically morphed into mastering the Japanese spirit and practicing the way of the imperial subject by the 1940s. Indeed, it was in institutional sites as the Tokyo Imperial Renovation Society and the later Thought Criminal Protection and Supervision Center system that the practice of Tenkō became increasingly defined through imperial ideology and served as a vehicle of ideological dissemination to the general public, which I argue in my book. Now, it is not my intention to single out Tsurumi specifically. In fact, I'm informed by his studies and have taken inspiration by the 3 volumes and his other writings, of course. But I believe this lack of attention to ideological mediation informs many of the other canonical post-war theories of Tenkō. There is not enough time to sufficiently work through each of these, but all of these theories, I believe, or I would argue, are structured on different binaries, whether it's, the difference between theory, lost my place, theory and reality, which is Maruyama's definition, state and individual, or Japan and West as other, which is Karatani Kojin's more recent theory, which I contend exclude the complex and dialectical mediations of ideology itself. So to conclude, my object today was neither to posit a more adequate explanation of why the political defections occurred in interwar Japan, nor to extrapolate another theory of modernity, Japanese or otherwise, from the phenomenon of Tenkō, but rather to question some of the basic assumptions that have informed our received understanding of Tenkō in order to open new lines of inquiry and generate new questions. By extension, then, this is also to remind us to reflect on what exactly we mean by identifying our object of analysis as something called Tenkō and what we hope to find by analyzing it. I hope to have brought attention to some of the exclusions and absences that have informed the conventional understanding of Tenkō as both a concept and historical phenomenon, so that we can move beyond the paradigm established in the 1950s and engage with the perennial historical, political, and yes, intellectual questions that Tenkō undoubtedly indexes. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Max, for this informative discussion. We're starting with a discussion of Tenkō and the concept of Tenkō. This greatly positions, I think, our panel to move now into the conversation about Tenkō literature, and then focus with Irena's presentation on one of the writers who is placed usually as part of the Tenkō literature category. I will continue our panel. Please, again, for the people, for those of us who have joined later in the process, please do post your questions if you have them in the chat. We will address them at the end of the three panelists' presentations. I will continue with my own panel presentation. My name is George Shiposh, and I currently teach Japanese literature and culture at both West University of Timișoara in Romania remotely, and at Washington University in St. Louis. I am one of the co-editors of the book that we saw Max show earlier, Tenkō Cultures of Political Conversions in Transwar Japan. I need to mention here that it was Irena Hayter and Mark Williams who originally started this project, a really welcome project, I should say, because the last discussions that we had about Tenkō publicly in the field of Japan studies were more than a decade old. So we needed to reposition this. And I think we found at this symposium that they organized in 2017 at the University of Leeds, I'm sure Irena will tell us a little bit more about that, we found a great bridge between experts and specialists and Tenkō scholars from the United States, the UK, Europe, and Japan, and we brought them together for this symposium. They brought them together. I just joined in. I would like to talk today about an extrapolation of Tenkō that generated Tenkō literature as a category. Tenkō bungaku is a category that sort of encompasses in a mishmash of texts, short and long, and novels and short stories and so on, encompasses what Tenkōsha, official Tenkōsha who came out of prison, as well as people who were part of the literary movement prior, of the proletarian literary movement prior to the Tenkō process, and people who had nothing to do with literature before, they were just like communist activists and so on, produced in an effort to deal with the process of Tenkō, either internally or externally, just like Max has pointed out, following Tsurumi Shunsuke's definition from 1959, to process through the emotional distress, through the shame generated by leaving one's comrades behind and declaring Tenkō and so on. There is a group of texts, a corpus of texts that basically is now called Tenkō bungaku. The denomination of Tenkō bungaku started as soon as the first text started popping up in 1934. The period itself covers about 1934-1942. Of text called today Tenkō bungaku. We did see in one of Max's slides the cover of Honda Shugo's 1957 Tenkō bungaku Ron volume that sort of defined, let's say, the category in and of itself. Now, the purpose of my talk today is not to challenge the category or reanalyze the category in and of itself. I have to say that there are questions about the validity of a category of Tenkō bungaku, and they are valid questions, they are valid criticisms of that category in and of itself, because ultimately it is difficult to bring together, like I said, professional writers who belonged to the proletarian literature movement, who were put in prison as members of the Communist Party, and who then had to publicly Tenkō, like Sano Nabeyama, other cadre and rank and file communists, and then had to come out and still be professional writers. They had to write, to continue to write in order to survive, right? And then with them to add writers who were never arrested, sympathizers of the movement, people who, female writers who, as we see in the studies of the Shisono Kagaku Kinkyukai, were not as much pursued by the authorities, because the idea was there is a very gendered value and dimension to Tenkō, where the main target of the Tenkō and the arrests of 1928, 1929, mass arrests of the communist activists, were actually focused on males. So females, whether they were members of the Communist Party of JCP, if they were not members, they were just not necessarily arrested or pressured in prison to declare a public Tenkō, to issue a Tenkō Seimei, a declaration of Tenkō. But these females, again, once they did not have the environment, the framework, ideologically, politically, socially, to exist within the communist circles, clubs and groups that existed prior to the Tenkō phenomenon, had to still continue to live, had to still continue to exist and write and publish. So they write pieces again that don't necessarily follow a public declaration of Tenkō, but they express through their writing their separation from the communist paradigm of thought and political ideals. And finally, you will have writers here who discover themselves as writers, like Shimaki Kensaku is a perfect example of this, discover themselves as writers after they Tenkō, after they come out of prison, and they start writing without having ever been writers before, and they become well-known writers. So all these groups together, you put them all together and you say, this is Tenkō Bungaku, this is Tenkō literature. Of course, it's questioned. It doesn't make much sense when you think about it. So again, far from me to say no, we do have a unitary definition of Tenkō Bungaku and all these texts should be together. But what I'm trying to do in my chapter in the book, as well as in a full book that is coming out next year from the same publisher, from Routledge in the United Kingdom, I rediscuss the role of this state authority and coercion that Tsurumi Shunsuke posited in 1959, and that sort of dualism between the external and the internal pressures, and I reevaluate it through the literary text. So I look at the literary text to see what I can find by keeping this hat on of the, on one hand, the external pressure put on by the authorities, and on the other hand, the personal, individual, internal pressure. Because you see, it is difficult to judge a period like the 30s and 40s in Japan, sort of outside of its context, and thinking that Tenkō is only done under state coercion and state pressure is obviously not realistic, right? The point of the entire militaristic system, militaristic regime of Japan in the 30s, and you think about it, if you think about it, the entire environment, politically, socially, economically, was an environment of terror, was an environment of coercion. I mean, we're looking at political assassinations left and right at the hands of Navy officers. We're looking at the last civilian prime minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, being killed in 1932, being assassinated in 1932. We're looking at a replacement of civilian, the last remnants of the so-called Taisho democracy, being replaced with military and prime ministers who were part of the military, and so on and so forth. So this creates an entire system of pressure, of coercion, that I believe, as someone having lived through 1980s Romania, it actually creates an environment where everybody's afraid. It doesn't matter if you were a communist activist or a liberal or an anti-imperial imperialist thought leader, a scholar or whatever. Everybody is sort of seeing all this. I mean, the purpose of the 1925 Chiani Jiho, the purpose of the following mass arrests of the communist cadre and rank and file members was to create a regime of terror, and these are, there's a lot of media attention on them. There's a lot of media attention on the people in prison. There's a lot of media attention on the Tenkō declaration, the so-called Tenkō declaration that Sano Manabu and Nabeyama Sadachika issue, of course, as we've seen in Max's presentation, dubbed so by the authorities themselves, right? So there is a propaganda machine that goes on there trying to create this environment of terror and trying to tell everybody who doesn't follow the line, beware. We're coming after you if you don't do this and that and the other. So my belief is that in this context, what we are seeing basically is a regime of terror being installed in preparation for what will follow the push into the Asia-Pacific War. And it's all connected with this movement towards conservatism, right? The Nihon Eno Kaiki movement. It is connected with the idea of Kindai no Chokoku, and we see the symposium in 1942 and the big debate, you know, of how to overcome modernity, right? After we embrace modernity, we realize that this is not what we want. This is not where we're wanting to go. So then we need to overcome it. We need to go back to an illo tempore, to a space and time that, you know, we can make up into whatever we want. And this struggle, again, this is a strife that's happened in Japanese society and in the Japanese psyche ever since the Meiji Restoration. I mean, it goes back, we can trace this back all the way to the mythologization of the Meiji emperor, to the creation of the idea of the family nation with the emperor at the head, to the idea of the unbroken dynastic imperial line, and to the idea of the emperor being not just an arahitogami, a god expressed in human flesh or in human form, but also the father of the nation. So these all these elements come together to create this 1930s, 1940s regime of terror as I see it. What happens in response is that the texts that are now dubbed Tenkō literature, Tenkō bungaku, do end up having a number of common threads. And I would like to talk about a couple of them today. I detailed them a little bit better in my chapter in the book Tenkō, Cultures of Political Conversion in Transwar Japan. And then, like I said, my plan is to go then and look author by author, writing by writing in my following book, in my next book, at how some of these traits and some of the peculiarities of each text are actually expressed either as resistance or acquiescence or adoption of the imperial militaristic discourse through literature. One of the things that one cannot help but be struck when reading across all this number of texts of Tenkō literature is the fact that there is a significant number of texts that utilizes the conventions of what has been called shishosetsu. And the I novel, the shishosetsu, again, I don't want to go into detail about what that means. It suffices to say, I believe here, that it is also a contested category, that people do not agree. I mean, we all probably know by now Tomi Suzuki's reflections and criticism of the category as a post factum assigned sort of category to a corpus of texts that, again, do not necessarily show unitary literary narratological structures and development. So taking that with the grain of salt that we need to take it with, I think of Shishosetsu as the type of fiction that puts sort of a narratological eye at the center. And again, as we've seen with major studies of it, Irmela Hijia Kirchnerite, and Fowler, and so on, you know, that can take different types of authorial sort of voice, either first person or third person, and so on. So looking through the Tenkō literature texts, one thing that we detect is an inversion towards, or an internal sort of look of the characters. And this is striking for somebody who reads proletarian literature. A lot of these writers, like we said, used to be proletarian writers. Well, what takes primacy in proletarian literature, if not the collective character, if not the mass description, if not the idea that the author and the narrator as well adopt the voice of the voiceless? They become the voice of the voiceless. Proletarian literature, of course, at its base is aimed to give a voice and to create a sort of political awareness, right? That's the point behind writing engaged literature when it comes to the proletarian movement. So this is a striking difference between focusing on the collective, focusing on the voiceless, and then suddenly you see writers like Nakano, like Sata Ineko, like Nakano Shigeharu, like Sata Ineko, looking inward, looking at themselves, looking at the I as a narratological, as a narrative instance. So now, in literature, in the Tenkō literature, there are also different thematic pieces that I think come together, thematic tropes, and they get expressed best when it comes to the conventional Shishosetsu method. Let's look, for instance, at the theme that I mentioned earlier, Nihon no Kaiki, the return to Japan. That is a major piece of many of the Tenkō literature pieces. Probably the most famous of them all, for all of us who studied modern literature, Japanese modern literature, is Nakano Shigeharu's short story Mura no Ie, the house in the village, a piece that has become iconic for Tenkō literature, and it is considered probably one of the most studied pieces of Tenkō literature and best known. In Mura no Ie, as we all may remember, the main character is, you may argue very easily, an alter ego of the writer himself, of Nakano Shigeharu himself, a writer by the name of Takahata Benji, who is released, just like many of the Tenkōsha were released, in his elderly parents' care after he declares Tenkō. All this is evident in the story. All of this matches more or less the actual reality, not just of Nakano Shigeharu, but of other male writers of the former proletarian literary movement and members of the Communist Party. What Takahata Benji ends up doing is being returned to the village and sort of going into an introspection, going back down the memory lane, trying to figure out what's happened. He is rebuilding, reconstructing himself, and he is faced with the choice of either joining traditional Japan, this imagined traditional Japan, the locus of the imagination of the conservatives in Japan, or determine that he needs to continue to fight, regardless of what's happened in prison, regardless of his Tenkō declaration. And the major discussion there is between this character, who is ostensibly a writer who's betrayed his comrades, who's betrayed his ideal and all that, and his elderly father, who realizes exactly what's happened, who understands exactly why the writer formerly involved and engaged politically should stop completely writing, should give up writing, join the family business, become go back home and take care of the home. Of course, the father voice is meant to sort of create the tension. It's meant to make the character reanalyze and re-understand what he needs to do moving forward. And he does exactly that. He determines that he needs to continue to resist and to continue to write. So it is a reevaluation here of writing itself, of the process of writing itself, done under the guise of a common trope of like return to Japan, one of the, like I said, of the dear topics of the conservatives of Japan on one hand, and on the other hand, under the guise of this shishosetsu narrative that allows the writer to sort of place different meanings and help, ask the reader to come in and participate. It is basically a participatory text in which the reader has to come in, has to try to identify where the writer is, and then move in and draw his own conclusions based on what the writer is telling us there. So this is one of the ways in which shishosetsu and Return to Japan are utilized by Tenkō writers to sort of show resistance and to deal with the trauma, with the emotional, psychological trauma of the Tenkō process itself. Let's remember, these are people who were put in prison, some of them tortured, some of them put under a lot of psychological abuse and pressure to issue declarations and so on and so forth. I mean, by the time Tenkō is perfected, we have actual textbooks from the Ministry of Justice that tell us exactly what you need to do step by step, tells the investigators what they need to do to put these people in place and make them realize the error of their ways and declare Tenkō, right? Finally, or not so finally, but another sort of very important theme that we detect throughout the Tenkō literature category is that of the family. We talked earlier about the family nation with the emperor at the head. But in response to that traditional family nation and to the traditional EA system of Japan, there was a new type of family that was being created, not just by the 1920s Mogas and Mobos out there, but also by the members of the leftist movement, of the communists and the socialists, who are trying to live in a modern type of modern type of life, a couple life, away from the countryside, away from their traditional families, away from their parents, be independent, sometimes get married, sometimes not, so just live together and have children together and so on. This is a major issue, of course, in the communist movement, not just in Japan, but all over the world. And specifically in Japan and Korea becomes a topic, a hot topic of discussion later in the post-war period, because of the status that is assigned to women in the movement, and because of the fact that they remain, at least in the minds of their male counterparts and comrades, they do remain subservient to the males. They do remain sort of they're being still put in a position of continuing to have a traditional position and you know, do the same sort of female generic tasks of the household, take care of the children and so on and so forth, while the males are out there being artistic and writing and so on and so forth. So this continues throughout the movement. Well, with Tenkō, the males are the target. They are arrested, they're taken away, they are put in prison, sometimes for a year, sometimes for 2, sometimes for 3, sometimes for 12 years, like we see in cases of Miyamoto Kenji and some of the Hitenkosha, the people who never Tenko'd in prison, right? What are then the female writers, the partners, to do in this situation? They still have children to take care of, they still have to generate revenue, and so on and so forth. So this is a major divorce that is happening within the group of proletarian and communist writers. So what we see here, another topic, a very important topic of the Tenkō literature, is the divorce. The theme of divorce is essential, and it shows up in numerous writings, both from male and female writers. And it is, of course, in many cases, a metaphor for the very Tenkō that is happening, for the very rupture between that old ideal of the modern family, equal rights between the members of the family, equal gender rights, and so on. That doesn't happen. That doesn't pan out in the end. On one hand, because the males are still very much anchored in the traditional society. On the other hand, because the society takes the males away. And I think that, you know, writers like Satai Neko expressed this brilliantly in stories like Kurenai, in novellas like Kurenai. But we also see it in her husband's Kubokawa Tsurujiro's Fun. We see it in Murayama Tomoyoshi's Byakuya and other texts of the time that all fall under the Tenkō literature category. Of course, many of these texts are also written from a Shishosetsu perspective, from a narrative eye perspective, where the persona, the character is sort of vaguely overlaps, right? According to the conventions of the Shishosetsu, vaguely overlaps with that of the author herself or himself. So these are consistent patterns that come throughout the Tenkō literature. If we think about the family shows up in all kinds of ways throughout the Tenkō literature, from the Kazoku Koka, the family nation, and the building of that family nation in novels like, again, the infamous Hayashi Fusao, the Tenkōsha par excellence, the one who joins the Imperial discourse and so on and so forth in Seinen, where Ito Hirobumi is the character, or an alter ego of Ito Hirobumi, obviously historical novel, through the return to Japan, to the traditional family and so on, and then finally to this rupture of the modern family that takes place. So these are just a few of the tropes that I'm identifying, and also of the literary conventions that I'm identifying throughout the literary texts of the so-called Tenkō literature category. Once again, I'm not trying to say this is a valid category and we all have to abide by it. And I'm not saying that it is not. I am trying to look at the elements that unite this and see if there is enough in the texts themselves to support the possibility that Tenkō literature actually has some sort of a validity as a response to a certain type of pressure from the outside. And if it is either resistance or acquiescence or collaboration with that ideology from the outside, it still has common threads that we can look at. I will stop here, and thank you everyone for listening. I will pass the microphone to Irena, to my colleague Irena, to talk about Takamijun.
Thank you, George. Is the video and audio all right on my side?
We can hear you perfectly.
Right, so let me share my screen now for Rio. Right, so I think George and Max mentioned this book, but sort of just indulge me in a couple of more minutes of plugging it. This panel sort of very nicely bookmarks the project, which sort of started with, a symposium at the University of Leeds. Then the book finally came out this June, and then the panel happens. So we are, we, meaning the editors, George, Mark, and myself, are kind of excited to bring this to the Japanese studies community, especially people who work on the, pre-war and post-war, interwar sort of history, literature, political history, and theory, because we have tried really to bring in a lot of new approaches, to examine sort of established sort of conceptual devices, terms, methodologies, binaries, as I'm sure you saw in the presentations of both George and Max, but also sort of to kind of dislodge Tenkō from its kind of identification with Japaneseness, with being sort of a uniquely Japanese experience, and instead sort of, squarely situated within sort of a very global crisis of modernity, empire, and engage with currents such as sort of fascism, the manipulation of language, media and ideology, methodology, as again, I think Jordan and Max's presentations made very clear. Also, you know, we have a chapter on Takeuchi Yoshimi and Tenkō in terms of China and Japan, but also on the Tenkō of anarchist poets or Korean intellectuals. So we've tried really sort of to open up this kind of whole conceptual and kind of historiographical and literary knot of Tenkō and bring in sort of new approaches. So I mean, it's up to the scholars in the field to say what they think about the book, but it certainly sort of, we get a real sense of closure, you know, the editors and the contributors that the book is finally out. So my own paper is basically focuses on a kind of a really, I suppose, modest narratological reading of a work and a writer who has been sort of undeservedly neglected. Both the work and the writer are very interested, you know, in terms of sort of the literature and politics of the 1930s, but also sort of in the post-war era. So I'm sort of trying to kind of shed some light through this close reading, not only on, you know, on how kind of Tenkō impacts issues of literary representation, and specifically sort of representations of subjectivity, of temporality in a literary narrative, because I'm looking at something which sort of deviates quite kind of starkly from the established view of Tenkō literature as sort of conforming to this Shishosetsu mode. So, but also sort of to question these kind of oppositions between modernism and Marxism, you know, form and content, you know, say the proletarian writers and the modernists, the Shinkan Kakuha, that still sort of serve as the foundations conceptually of how we look at, you know, this interpretive regime of interwar literature. And hopefully I managed to challenge these binaries to a certain point. Right. So I'll start with a quote which the young Nakamura Mitsuo, a very distinguished sort of post-war literary critic, hurled at some leftist writers. Was it not you, the proletarian writers, who most boldly crushed, or at least attempted to crush, this tradition of the Shishosetsu? Did you, gentlemen, abandon your literary theory together with your so-called political position? So the writers that, you know, Nakamura Mitsuo addressed so angrily were leftist writers who were in custody or imprisoned in the wide-ranging repressions of leftists, and who, often a couple of months after their release, published accounts of their experiences in the thinly disguised autobiographical form of the Shishosetsu. So according to Nakamura, there was this kind of real vogue of confessional narratives of Tenkō, of their political conversion in the mass circulation magazines. So Nakamura questions this kind of commodification of the experience, but also the fact that this kind of the Shishosetsu, whom, you know, the kind of both the modernists and the proletarian writers rejected only, you know, 5-6 years ago, is kind of coming back in a way. So, and indeed he's right, because the works which are most often cited as the best examples of Tenkō literature all appeared in quick succession in 1934-35. I've sort of listed some on this slide, and they were authored by proletarian writers, and they do conform to the narrative and rhetorical grammar of the Shishosetsu. So that's, for example, Murayama's Midnight Sun, Shimaki's Leprosy and Blindness, and Nakano Shigeharu's Dai Issho, or and also Murano Ien, the more widely known one. So Takami Jun's debut novel, Kokyu wa Sureu Beki, or Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? I will refer to it as Old Acquaintance in the paper, is sort of very much contemporaneous with this boom of Tenkō literature. Takami was active in the proletarian culture movement. He was arrested in February 1933 and released 3 months later after signing a Tenkō statement. His novel, however, is strikingly different from the texts of Murayama Tomoyoshi and Nakano Shigeharu. For example, the experience of Tenkō is treated very, very obliquely. It's almost absent, mentioned only in passing. It doesn't form the narrative and ethical center of the work. But what is even more interesting, that rather than a protagonist, who is based on the author, we have this sort of radically decentered narrative universe with several characters and the perspective sort of shifting between them. There are also a lot of digressions and a lot of distortions of linear temporality. So the stories are not told in a straightforward manner. The style is very sprawling, very discursive, and you have this sort of really kind of chatty, verbose narrator, appearing from in certain moments, commenting on his own writing, addressing the characters directly, and even sort of intervening into their thoughts. So you have both sort of a certain kind of wink towards, Edo period Gesaku literature, but also especially having in mind Takami Jun's degree in English literature from Tokyo Imperial University, perhaps sort of also a nod to kind of, Tristram Shandy and this kind of playful pedantry that deconstructs the novel. So Honda Shugo, in his seminal essay on Tenkō literature, described Takami's novel as one of the high peaks of Tenkō literature. However, Honda and the other sort of critics, and they can be counted on the fingers of one hand, who have written on the work, are very critical of it. They consider it a failed attempt at proper realism, and an unsuccessful Tenkō novel that is not confessional enough. So in most of these sort of critical readings of the work, it's kind of quite eccentric form, the kind of the modernist denaturing of narrative order, of deep interiority. These kind of very interesting things are either ignored or they're attributed to extra-textual biographical facts about its author. Basically, because of the Tenkō and because his wife left him, Takami couldn't get his act together and couldn't write a proper novel, as it were. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is take issue with such readings and kind of concentrate on the formal structures of the work, but look at them in the larger historical and discursive moment of Tenkō. And my argument is that in this work, the formal, as it were, stages the historical, and that rather being simply whimsical or kind of immature, the structures of the novel are very deeply motivated, indeed even symptomatic of this kind of aporia of Tenkō and the way Tenkō affected issues of narrative, of subjectivity, of psychic temporality. And through this close reading, I also aim to re-examine these creative tensions between form and content, Marxism and modernism, which, as I already mentioned, have been kind of reified into these sort of static, rigid binaries, and which we still kind of, reach for when we try to kind of make sense of 1920s, 1930s Japanese literature, the whole kind of field. So, very briefly, in terms of plot, the novel focuses on a group of friends, all Tokyo University graduates who reconnect by chance sometime after university. Their present lives and characters are very different, but there is this sort of air of kind of slight despair, a kind of a decadence running under the surface around them all. Long chunks of the novel are devoted to their time at higher school, where they belong to a group studying leftist thought. And what brings these kind of diverse characters and strands of the plot together is the suicide of another former classmate. His name is Savamura. His life and death are the only ones that are told as a straightforward and coherent narrative. He worked as a labor organizer. He was arrested, imprisoned, committed Tenkō. Then after he was released, it took him some time to kind of get back to normal middle-class life, after which, shockingly, he committed suicide. But this kind of very straightforward telling of Savamura's life only serves to kind of emphasize negatively the more fragmented and elliptical manner in which the stories of the other characters are presented. So on this slide, I have some sort of quite crude kind of diagrams of two chapters of the sort of progression of temporality in the chapters. And you don't need to look at them in detail, but basically just kind of to visualize kind of very quickly these kind of very complex, movements in temporality and kind of the abundance of kind of retrospections in the narrative. So in the whole work, there's no kind of strong will towards a linear narrative. What comes across is that the work is almost sort of perversely fixated on the past. The characters are perversely fixated on the past. And Ozeki, the sort of character who appears here in chapters 1 and 9, is most kind of nostalgically immersed in the past. He kind of directly articulates, the plenitude of the past against the kind of a present which is very, very barren in a way. So these kind of subjective retrospections by each of the characters take very significant chunks of the text, especially in these chapters 1, 4, and 9. While there are chapters that are sort of exclusively focused on the time of the characters at higher school. So the past basically emerges as sort of more authentic than their present. And if the past is so important to the characters, then it's kind of difficult to make sense of these kind of mischievous interventions of the narrator into their kind of subjective memories and retrospections. So again, here I've kind of put together some examples of how the character kind of intervenes, say, in Ozeki's daydreaming to point to draw the attention of the reader to his lustfulness, or says, instead of sort of paying attention to what they're doing now, I will sort of, sketch briefly the history of their friendship and addresses the reader, what do you think? In a way, he kind of intervenes, almost kind of dismisses even the validity of their experiences and memories, almost kind of refusing them the right to represent their own past. So why is this interesting? I think that if we can kind of describe, identity in one way as the sort of this continuity of the self in time, or the possibility to construct the coherent narrative of the self, where kind of past and present are organically linked, then these kind of, transgressions of the narrator, the fragmented temporal structure of the work, have the effect of depriving the characters of subjectivity and agency even. So this is all the more strange, the interventions of the narrator, because otherwise the characters are endowed with interiority and psychological depth. And this is achieved through this kind of point of view narration, through interior monologues, through sort of the shifts of point of view between the characters. Sometimes these shifts are very abrupt, unexpected. They kind of can occur even, in the space of paragraphs. And as I mentioned, the interior monologues as well sort of construct the characters as these autonomous subjects. So the narrator also sort of, he comments on, his own story, his own narrative. This is sort of how cool and flamboyant he is. If you look at sort of the quotes at number 4 and number 5, so he kind of, sometimes he exaggerates certain conventions, uses them too literally, like this idea of the transcendental, omniscient narrator. He transgresses narrative levels, so he can comment on the story and on the characters, and then he can sort of suddenly enter the narration as if he kind of is at the same ontological level as his characters. And here at 4 and 5, this I think comes across very clearly. In the last passage, especially this number 5, the narrator performs this sort of classic formalist laying bare of the device, basically revealing, stressing the fact that Akiko is simply a fictional character. So this kind of ontological volatility of the characters, do we kind of accept them as autonomous subjects, or are they kind of manipulated like puppets by the narrator? This is, I think, the fundamental tension running through the work. And this kind of fluid position of the narrator, sometimes being here, sometimes there, creates this kind of epistemological indeterminacy. So how do we make sense of this, not purely narratologically, but, you know, historically, in a way? So in this work, I think this kind of this destructuring of both temporality and subjectivity resonates very powerfully with sort of the historical and political moment of the 1930s, and particularly with these ideological reversals of Tenkō. So to understand why Tenkō had such profound effects on issues of subjectivity and psychic temporality and their literary representation, we need to consider the influence Marxism wielded in intellectual and academic circles in the late 1920s and 1930s. It has to be stressed that the Marxism that took student radicals by storm was Marxism as interpreted by the young theoretician Fukumoto Kazuo. So before Fukumoto, in its early days, leftist thought in Japan did not even distinguish between the ideas of Marx and those of Engels. It was heavily economistic with a strong social evolutionary slant. So the founder of the Japanese Communist Party, Yamakawa Hitoshi, was in many ways a typical figure with his emphasis on syndicalism and economic struggle. What Fukumoto did was bring to the movement hitherto unknown theoretical sophistication and intellectual rigor. So Fukumoto studied in Germany, profoundly influenced by Lukács and sort of similar Marxists at the time. So in the writings of Fukumoto, the term Tenkō described a change in the subject that involved both action impacting on the outside world, but also interior reflection. Tenkō in the writings of Fukumoto has this sort of connotations of spontaneity, of agency. It implied a kind of a reshaping of the self. In Fukumoto's thought, as Karatani Kojin has pointed out, class struggle is conceived as intrinsic to subjectivity, interior to the subject. So to be a pure Marxist, you had to liberate yourself from pretty bourgeois mentality, to sacrifice private happiness for the movement and reject any worldly success, even if you were an elite graduate of Tokyo Imperial University. So there was a strong element of repression and self-denial. Fujita Shozo, post-war political thinker, also stresses that the obsession with theory makes the generation of these left-in students very kind of different from earlier radicals, for example, like Osugi Sakae. So for the followers of Fukumoto Kazuo, Western theory was the orthodoxy and Japanese society was simply this kind of matter, the object onto which it should be applied. The superiority of Western theory over the knowledges of a non-Western society was not questioned. So this total reshaping of subjectivity, according to written theoretical texts, and this kind of disciplining of desire of the body can be seen, I think, as a technology of the self in Foucault's terms. So as I've sort of put here on this quote, technologies of the self is basically, these are sort of resources by which, individuals, sort of shape up their own bodies and souls in order to transform themselves to kind of attain a certain state of happiness, purity, perfection, immortality, etc. And for Foucault, the self constitutes itself at any given time using the techniques historically available to it. Again, it is a model of active agency, not coercion. And I think it can be really productive if we want to think about the role of Marxist theory for the young Japanese radicals in the 1920s. Back to sort of Marxist history, this kind of fetishization of abstract knowledge and this kind of will to theoretical purity not only contributed to the excessive factionalism and the subsequent defeat of the movement in Japan, according to post-war thinkers such as Fujita Shozo and Maruyama Masao, they also condemned Japanese Marxists to a total isolation from sensuous reality and from inherited social bonds. For Fujita, and this is sort of the quote I've put here, Tenkō usually occurred as an interior transformation linked to external incidents which dragged Homo theoreticus from the transcendental level of his confrontation with Japanese society down to the real world. So these sort of bonds of commonality, community, empathy, which Fukumotoism broke with Tenkō, with sort of the, renouncing, giving up Marxist ideas, reasserted themselves with full force. So as sort of, both Marx and George talked about, so Tenkō also stands for a certain cultural realignment, for a return to a Japaneseness which is perceived as natural and organic. So Marxism, because it has these sort of materialist conceptions of society and history, was sort of often considered as a metonymy for Western modernity. So it's in this broader meaning of abandoning modernity and the West in order to immerse oneself in a community supposedly untouched by alienation, that Tenkō can be sort of, one of the governing metaphors of the long 1930s in Japan. And as kind of George and other scholars have pointed out, it resonates with these kind of anti-modern epistemologies of the discourses of the return to Japan and overcoming modernity. So the opposition of theory on one hand, very sort of dry theory, and affect, this sort of a warmth of emotion, of community, of bonds, or the opposition of Marxism and Japaneseness are the most potent tropes of Tenkō discourse, as seen, for example, sort of very, very emphatically in the writings of Hayashi Fusao. So Hayashi rejected the model of ideological conversion. He rejected the slogan from Marxism to Japanism as the simplistic replacement of one abstract ideology with another. Hayashi called on the Tenkōsha to discard everything, to connect directly in an unmediated manner to the self and to their humanity, to sort of refuse the mediation of the intellect. And as sort of Marx as well stressed earlier, there are these, with regards to Kobayashi Morito, there's these kind of religious or quasi-religious metaphors and images of rebirth, of return, of revival in all Tenkō writing. So if we follow Fujita Shozo's contention that Fukumotoism posited a subjectivity shaped by written theoretical texts, it will be possible to argue that the collapse of Marxism as a technology of the self would bring on a crisis of subjectivity. So this celebratory discourse of rebirth, of sort of official discourse of Tenkō, glosses over this kind of rupture of psychic temporality, because the subject of Tenkō has to construct backward, retroactively, his past as inauthentic in order to kind of embrace his authentic present. So Tenkō does not only complicate the continuity and coherence of the self in time. It also problematizes narrative temporality. So this kind of renunciation of one's past, devotion to Marxism, to abstract theory, and kind of secondary construction of the past is inauthentic, in a way kind of, futures and brings together the traumatic crisis of subjectivity opened up by the experience. Very kind of often is a persistent motif, this kind of return to the naked self before ideology is also a return to the village community. And as sort of George also sort of stressed earlier, there is a family there, but the family is in Tenkō literature, but it's not portrayed as sort of a patriarchy, but it's this sort of warm matriarchal community that is sort of bound by empathy outside, as it were, these sort of the alienations of the symbolic order. So in kind of psychoanalytical terms, if there is a breakdown of subjectivity, subjectivity as constructed by Marxist texts, then we have this kind of regression, a return to kind of mother-bound plenitude. And I don't think it's a simple coincidence that in the 1930s, imperial ideology emphasized immediacy and organic presence, and also identified the emperor with nature, with the maternal. His subjects were his infants. So, which shows that the ideology of Tenkō worked in much more sophisticated ways than simple coercion. So just sort of to wrap up with a conclusion. So for Takami's characters, Tenkō might have been a release from the demands that Marxist theory and praxis placed on both body and consciousness, but it's not a celebratory one. The mediocrity of their present openly resists the ideological constructions of Tenkō as a second life. The novel's obsession with the past is a radical inversion of this official discourse of rebirth, of kind of inauthentic past. And the ontological instability of the characters, the interventions and manipulations of the narrator, in a way are symbolic enactments of these kind of dislocations of subjectivity that comes with Tenkō. So to write a confessional novel about the experience that tells a coherent story and validates this kind of mode of self-representation would be sort of to gloss over the traumas and contradictions of Tenkō. In Takami's work, the traumatic rupture and the aporetic underrepresentability of the whole experience are not suppressed, they are brought to the foreground. In a way, Tenkō can be narrated only symptomatically through the eccentric formal structures of Takami's work. And it articulates a perpetually fractured subjectivity. There's no attempt to overcome the crisis through a return to the communal body or a dissolution of the self into the imperial totality. So in his time, amidst this kind of swelling nativist currents and the calls to transcend modernity, Takami's volatile characters remain figures of resistance, resolutely dissented and modern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irena. Always very interesting to hear your analysis. I enjoy particularly this maternal positioning of the coercion versus maternal. I always like that sort of dichotomy that I think helps us think about, is it an embrace or is it a rejection, right? Where is Tenkō positioned and how is Tenkō perceived? Of course, from Steinhoff onwards, we've been seeing Tenkō as a reintegration, right? We've been perceiving Tenkō as a reintegration. What kind of reintegration is it though? And I like this gendered, is it a matriarchal or is it a patriarchal one, right? Is it an embracing one or rejecting one? Very interesting. Thank you, Max, as well for these presentations. I would like to open up for questions from our colleagues who have stayed with us through this hour-long, or a bit more than an hour actually, presentations. So please I see a question from Atsuko Sakaki. Thank you. Yes. Can you see it, Irana? I think it's for you.
Yeah, I'm reading it.
Please.
Who were the readers of the post-conversion narratives as intended and also in effect? Were they expected to be read by census fellow activists who may or may not have gone through conversion themselves, or general readers? Did the writers keep in mind the potential audience when they write? If so, to what degree is it deducible from their rhetoric what their true intents were? Okay, I think this is more also not only, I'll try to respond. Thank you, Atsuko-san. I think without kind of taking into consideration the readership and the whole media ecology of it, this is again sort of the media is another thing we try to sort of bring to the foreground and interrogate in the book. It's difficult to understand Tenkō. So quite a lot of these narratives were basically aimed, I think, in the kind of highbrow general magazines, you know, Chuo Koron and Kaizo and stuff. Sata Iniko published hers in Fujin Koron as well. So with Takami, I think it was more kind of a doujinshi. It was in Jinmin Bunko. Yes, I think it's a coterie magazine he published together with, you know, with some other writers. So I'd say maybe, I mean, George might think differently. There are two elements there. First, there's this sort of element that both the Marxist boom and Tenkō were actually consumed and slightly commodified, and sort of the writers conformed to this. With Sata Ineko, I think it's sort of very, very clear. Also, so that's the reason why I think they kind of appeared in kind of big, kind of highbrow magazines with very large circulations. But also, I think in Takami's case, especially, and this is sort of a welcome, I think, insight that his intended readership were probably people like him, you know, former leftist Tenkō writers, and that's why perhaps kind of the kind of satiric, ironic charge is so merciless. He talks about not that most of them were leftist fans. They weren't committed, you know. They were just playing at ideas and kind of performing Marxism, while this guy, Savamura, who killed himself, was for real. He was a labor organizer. So I think, yeah, the kind of the addressees, the readership, I think is a very important moment that I think we need to develop our engagement with Tenkō in that direction. So thank you, Atsuko-san. Perhaps George would want to come in on readership as well, because he has a wider view.
Thank you, Irena. Yeah, that's a great question. I do believe actually that there was an intended readership, that there was a communication with those readers. I mean, let's remember proletarian writers, and again, Tenkōsha writers are not all former proletarian writers. They're actually people who come in as Tenkō writers, and they don't have necessarily a background in writing for proletarian leadership. But when you look at people like Nakano, like Sata, they had a wide following. These people were, if you will, VIPs of the literary world in their own way. I mean, just remember, their lives were put on stage. Sata's divorce is a big deal. Miyamoto Yuriko and Miyamoto Kenji's marriage is a big deal. It's like all this display on media everywhere. So there's a following there. And then also there is a sort of a loyalty of the readership that's inherited from the Bundan world of the teens and the 20s. So, you know, even though interestingly enough, for a lot of the readership, if you look at readership in between proletarian literature and Tenkō literature, you see an expansion. Actually, because of the media spotlight on the proletarian writers, their bundan expands. So what I believe I discovered in one of the texts in Murano-ie is the fact that Nakano writes for a larger audience suddenly, but he also tries to send certain keys narratively to his own readers, to the following loyal readers. So I think there's a dual thing here where there are the readers that have been following these writers and they know who they are, they know where they're coming from, and they know that what they've been through. And then there's like a wider readership now because they're Tenkōsha and there's interest. And yeah, they do publish in Kaizo, they published in Chuo Koron. I mean, these are major magazines of the time with a wide readership. So this is a very interesting issue. Yeah. Thank you.
Shall I kind of respond to Atsuko-san's kind of second question about kind of Takami's position within literary history?
Please,
you don't have to, other people might have questions. So I just wanted to write down my thoughts so you can just think about it later. So I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see if there are other questions maybe, and then perhaps the time permitting, depending on Filippo and Nozomi, we can determine if time permits us to go a bit over, or we're done at 15, Filippo and Nozomi?
As far as we are concerned, if there are some unanswered questions, we can go overboard like 10 minutes or something like that.
Okay.
It's not, unless people have other commitments or so.
Sure, thank you. Are there any other questions from our colleagues? For Max or Irena, myself. Yes, Adam?
Adam-san.
Yes.
Oh, hello. This is somewhat unrelated, but I am working on my dissertation project about the wartime literature and about the writing from the front from the colonies. And as I'm currently writing the chapter on the literary framework, my thesis is that the Shishosetsu mode was utilized in order as a vessel for propaganda, because there is this pact of authenticity. Mm-hmm. And also it is a genre or mode of writing that would be familiar to the readers, and therefore perhaps theoretically have a more persuasiveness in its contents. And of course, because it's Shishosetsu, is free of ideology on its surface, and only pertains to the immediate reality of the narrator, right? So I wanted to ask you, because I don't know as much about Tenkō as I should I look into this as a continuation of the trend, since you mentioned, and I mean, yes, we all know that, I just forgot that the Tenkō literature was very Shishosetsu heavy. And so I wanted to ask you if I should look into this and possibly edit my second draft, because it is very interesting, and I was struggling with structuring the chapter in the literary framework, because everything seems relevant to me, and you really have to go back years before the war, because what we see during the war is just a result of what was happening in the literary culture. Thank you.
That's right. Irena, would you like to take a stab at it? I have my Sata examples and others, but please.
I have to say, Adam, this is a great question, and I'm profoundly ignorant about wartime literature. I know that I think Takami is a bit ambivalent, because he used to write both more experimental work and kind of, Shishosetsu side by side. I know that in the 1960s, he sort of wrote a novel about the Manchurian incident and no, it wasn't the story. It was about Nini Rokujiken. It's called Iyana Kanji. And that sort of, again, it engages with the colonies. It's and that's supposedly his best. But I think it's kind of, I think George has a wider view. I'm very much, kind of concentrating in the 1930s and stuff. And I really haven't looked at the front. But good luck. I think it's important to be conscious of form, when you are, and this kind of really the Shishosetsu as this kind of a dominant form, and various Oedipal revolt against it, and then sort of coming back to it because of the pact that you mentioned, because of sort of the way the Bundan even is set and the way literature is consumed. Yeah.
All right. And Adam, again, for me as well, I'll echo Irena's thoughts. This is a brilliant way to look at it. I mean, we do have to find the genealogy of this writers and where it's coming from. And when you look at some of the Tenkō writers, they do continue actually straightforward into wartime literature, and they do use the Shishosetsu mode to actually express support for the imperial expansion, for the war effort, and so on and so forth. Like I said, Satai Neko is case in point here. and we see her heavily involved, dispatched to Manchuria with the writer battalions and so on and so forth. So she will send back that, and this is part of her Tenkō process as well. I mean, we have to look again and to echo again Irena's sort of a female-male look at Tenkō. I think it's very important to see how Sata, for instance, as a female writer, adopts that position where she needs to go into supporting the imperial mission. But there is an element, there's a family element in there that we need to remember. Again, Kubokawa, her husband, is out of the picture. She needs to maintain, to raise 2 children, and she needs to generate revenue because she's a professional writer. There is a very interesting case of a writer that I compared once with one of Sata's stories. I don't remember how long ago this was, but she is a Korean writer who's also a Tenkōsha. And she writes in 1940s, she ends up in North Korea after the war, and she got lost until the 1990s. Very interesting case. Che Chong-hee is her name. And she writes a short story in 1942 called Nogikusho, the wild chrysanthemum. I think it must have been Sarah Frederick who took a stab at translating.
Yes.
Right. So, you know, Che Chong-hee then writes in the Wild Chrysanthemum as a Tenkō piece that is so brilliant, it gives you shivers to read it, because what's happening there's a mother who takes her son to the Japanese military training camp and basically tells him, I wanted you to visit this. She meets with the military commander I wanted to see this because this is your future. You are committed to becoming a soldier of the empire. And basically what you see there is that there's this mother in a heavily Confucian society who's been left behind by her common law partner because he's a Tenkōsha, he's gone, he's out of the picture, and she needs to do something. What is she going to do? She's going to commit to the empire. What choice does she have? And she's putting her son out there to say, you are going to be a soldier of the empire, you better get used to it. It's just a phenomenal story. If you get a chance to see it, to read it, and utilize it in some way, I think that the Tenkōsha in Korea are largely forgotten and ignored at this point. And most of them, by the way, write in Japanese because, of course, it was the language of the empire by then. So this is another element that I think you can take into account when it comes to the war literature. So I certainly believe that there is a genealogy there. Not all wartime writers are Tenkōsha, but there are some who deserve attention. Thank you. Yeah, that's great, Adam. I'm excited to read your research.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book.
I see another question here from Kageki-san. Tells us, I'd like to ask, how do you understand conversion and contra-conversion in Manchuria? Okay. The main military person of aggression in there was regarded as a contra-conversion person. Okay, yes. So yes, many Marxists moved to Manchuria, and this is another part where we look at again from a literary perspective. We look at people who are actually escaping to Manchuria, writing from Manchuria. Others escaped to Hokkaido. Shimaki case in point here, and Seikatsu no Tankyu is case in point here. Anarchism, on the other hand, Kageki-san, I think we have in the book we have a chapter put together by Murata Hirokazu-san. From, I think he's at Hokkaido Daigaku now. He writes about anarchist poets, a chapter I suggest in their Tenkō. So please take a look at there. But Max, do you have any insight on this? I don't think I'm competent enough to answer the Manchurian situation. Max, are you? I don't think Max is still here. I don't know. Max, can you hear us?
I can. My internet's unstable.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hear me? So yeah, I apologize for that. So I just missed that last section.
Yeah. So in the questions, if you can see the questions, I think there's a question about Manchuria and the conversion and contra-conversion in Manchuria. The example given here is that in Tsurumi's book, Ishihara Kanji was regarded as a contra-conversion book, and then Hirata Isao moved to Manchuria in the late 1930s. So if there's anything that you'd like to add to this Manchurian sort of element,
I think it. Oh,
sorry. Let me explain more about my question.
Okay. Please.
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, Hirata thought that convergent Marxists, not convergent totally. So he thought he have to teach, lead them into totally conversion in Manchuria, since many Marxists moved to Manchuria. However, in Manchuria until 1940, as you know, Zolge incident and Ozaki Hozumi, they tried to establish socialist or communism country in Manchuria. So it's very parallelly situations proceeding in Manchuria with convergence Marxists. So if you have some idea about that, I'd like to know about that. Thank you.
Right, great. So yeah, so I've looked mostly at the Korean Tenkō more than the Manchurian, but I'm aware of the movement there. I don't have much insight on that. That's why I invited Max or Irena to let us know if they are able to answer, if they're better informed on this. I don't think Max's internet is working well, so. Irena, would you like to?
I'm not very sort of familiar with the specifics and the particular histories of writers and intellectuals moving to Manchuria, but I think it was Marx, I think, who kind of stresses that basically in the Sano Nabayama statements from the very beginning, what they envisage is not sort of Japan as a nation. They envisage sort of a new imperial order which will sort of liberate the people of sort of East Asia and stuff, and Manchuria is definitely there. So I think there is this kind of, you have both kind of lapsed Marxists, for example, it's sort of Yasuda Yojiro, but also sort of people who still think that they're committed, that they sort of move to Manchuria as sort of this place beyond modernity and imperialism and beyond capitalism, and kind of approach it with a certain idealism, not sort of aware that they're basically falling into the imperial trap and stuff. But I think also, I suppose there are similar kind of contradictions with Korean intellectuals as well. So perhaps Jun Hong's sort of chapter in the book might be kind of offer some insights. Because, I wasn't aware of that so much. And also sort of with the anarchists, this thing about decentralization and, kind of focusing on certain kind of pre-modern folk figures and stuff, and idealizing them, again, sort of resonates and is eventually co-opted into kind of official Japanism. So it's very interesting. Good luck. I'm looking forward to reading your, is it a PhD dissertation you're working on or a book? Kageki-san.
It's just an article in one book, so part of the book. So it's not become a huge research. However, in future, I'd like to write about Tenkō convergence in Manchuria. Because as you mentioned about, and how do I say, there's some sort of Marxism with empire is appeared, so and it's very familiar to even anarchists. So but I will someday I will write about detail of it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
We'll be looking forward to it. Yeah. I mean, the thing with us people doing Interwar Japan, that we think that this is the most interesting thing ever. So, yes. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Kage-san. Are there any other questions from our colleagues? should we, would you like to try to address Sakaki-san's question about Takami, Irena?
If the others are not bored about sort of talking about Takami and one particular writer, Sakaki-san, he's sort of normally kind of, I don't know, he's discussed as, you know, around Jinmin Bunko and kind of the sort of the last bastion of opposition against fascism, even Takami, pre-war. Sometimes he's mentioned, you know, by Japanese literary historians. This is what piqued my interest, together with sort of, you know, Ishikawa Jun or even Dazai, or even sort of Uno Koji. And I think what kind of unites them together is a certain historical moment, sort of 1934, 1936, where lots of writers who are normally sort of classified into different schools kind of publish work which really kind of engages with, deconstructs basically the Shishōsetsu or modern Japanese narrative as we know it. And they all kind of belong to different movements, and they come with different inspirations, whether it will be André Gide or whether kind of in the case of Takami and Ito say is more kind of, you know, sort of Anglo-American modernism, I think. But also we have a particular political moment, a political media ecology where the old Bundan is disintegrating. So there is no pact of authenticity. And, you know, the self can't be constructed in, you know, by addressing the readers. So you have these kind of deconstructions of the self and, you know, both kind of anxiety and irony against the commodification of literature. So I think this is what unites them. It's a historical moment, maybe a post-Tenkō moment. And even with the writers who are not Marxist, you know, Marxism was important, and also a certain media ecology. And I think also there's what Takami, for example, shares with Dazai, also they're so different, is a certain literary Dantism. This is, I want to explore this sort of further, a certain performance and fashioning of the self that also impacts on literary form, I think. Conscious of kind of photography, visuality, cinema, visual devices and stuff, and a certain presentation of the self, of the writer that comes into it. But I'm still sort of not sure about this. But thank you for these very engaging questions.
Which then Irena, right, slides straight into Mishima's post-war persona and mafia movies and all that. I mean, there is a dandyism there that continues from Dazai. I look at Dazai and Mishima as a parallel pre-war, post-war. And I think that just falls right in there in terms of expressing modernism, expressing the body through modern means. Excellent. Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, I mean, you have our contact information. If you would like to continue the conversation offline, we're happy to do so. I would like to thank my co-panelists and my colleagues, Irena and Max. It's been wonderful to get together again and do this panel. I would like to thank Filippo and Nozomi as the co-conveners of the modern literature section. We're very happy that we were able to present here with our colleagues, and as well to Enrique Mora, our volunteer support today, who helps us with the technical aspect of the panel. Please stay in touch and have a good afternoon, evening, late morning, whatever it is, wherever you are.
Thank you, George, for sharing, to Irena and Max for this very interesting and insightful panel. I guess I definitely learned a lot more than I knew about Tenkō. So, and it opens up a lot of interesting scenarios and comparisons, and I hope we can all take this conversation further in other venues, and hopefully we'll see each other in person at some events soon. Thank you very much, and thank you very much people who attended to the last and asked questions. Thank you very much from me and Nozomi.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the participants as well for the good question. Especially Sasaki Sensei, a lot of questions that we really appreciate for the panel as well. Thank you very much for your insight.